Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name's Steve. I'm a security leader by day, and by night I guess I write LinkedIn content and create YouTube videos all about cyber security. And today I'm going to talk about Gloucester City Council, who in 2021 had a massive ransomware attack. Now, if you're not familiar with the geography of the UK, Gloucester is a small city. It's in the west of England. And because they're a public authority, they've released lots of really good reports about what happened in the attack. They've released the actual incident response report about the breach, and then also the Information Commissioner's Office, that's the ICO, so the folks who enforce things like GDPR here in the UK, have also released a report all about it. So on the whole, for us as defenders, there's some really rich information available about what happened and then what we can learn from it. This breach was attributed to the Conti ransomware as a service group, and interestingly their dwell time, so that's the time in which from when they first compromised the network to when they executed their ransomware, was over 1 month. So that's 1 month that they were active within the network of the Gloucester City Council, that's the GCC by the way, active within their network, able to move around, probe different infrastructure, understand how they operated, and then finally execute their ransomware. So the initial access of this ransomware was via a phishing email, and that's not at all uncommon. One of the reports alludes to it being from a supplier, and again, that's not uncommon that you see a member of your supply chain, they have an inbox compromise, and that's used to spread other malware. And it's a great way to do it because it's from a trusted source. Folks are more likely to open attachments or click links. All that we know from the reporting is that the phishing email delivered a zip file. We don't have any further information than that. My guess, knowing some of the way these groups operate, is within that zip file would be something like an ISO file, within which would be probably a batch file or an LNK file, and those would be used together to download and execute malware. Again, the reporting isn't too explicit, but it sounds like Cobalt Strike was used. If you're not familiar with Cobalt Strike, it's a pen testing framework or tool. It's available for download for trial, and it's used quite frequently by ransomware groups just to provide command and control and provide the initial foothold into an organization. So at this point in the breach, the ransomware group have got a foothold within the GCC, they've got their malware running, they've got access to a machine called Patient Zero in this case, because it's the first machine that got compromised. They were then able to get hold of privileged credentials. Reading between the lines of the report, it sounds like a privileged user logged in to Patient Zero. Depending on the way that you configure Windows, in this case it wasn't configured to prevent this, it basically deposits or caches a copy of the credentials for that privileged user on the machine. So if that's an attacker controlled machine, they can then take those privileged credentials and then use them elsewhere. And for lateral movement, the group were using remote desktop protocol. It's a very common way to move laterally around a Windows network. So they could take those privileged credentials and using RDP, merrily move around the GCC network. The group was also able to establish persistence by using remote management and monitoring tools, or RMMs, things like TeamViewer, AnyDesk, the kind you just download, you run a client, and then through the browser you can access the desktop of the machine that you've compromised. Those are legitimate tools, they're not uncommon for lots of help desk folks to be using, so they generally blend in within a network. They're also really easy for the attackers to use for their persistence. In this case, the attackers also exfiltrated data from the GCC. They used a command line tool called rclone that you can link to different cloud repositories such as Mega or Dropbox or OneDrive, for example. And that means that from the command line, you can very easily export gigabytes, terabytes of data really easily. And all of this went undetected within the GCC network before they finally deployed ransomware and then gave a ransom to the GCC to pay. From the evidence I've seen, it sounds like they didn't pay the ransom and instead they launched into a big recovery effort. And in this whole story, it's actually the recovery which is really interesting. The reporting talks about it taking over 18 months to recover all the GCC services after the compromise had happened. And the reporting as well doesn't talk too much or give too much detail about what security they had in place before the compromise. And that's a real shame because it could be useful for defenders like us to learn what organisations had, what worked, what didn't work. But again, reading between the lines on the report, it doesn't sound like they had anything like EDR, for example. That's endpoint detection and response. I've talked about it in a previous video, and it is usually critical, absolutely key to avoiding ransomware. In their accounts, the GCC also talk about the cost of recovery, buying new software, buying new hardware, the cost of paying for an instant response firm, and all in that comes to just over £1 million. So what can we learn as defenders from this? So I think first of all, the necessity for a good phishing filter. Phishing, spear phishing, whaling, all of these things attackers are still using because they're effective. So having good defenses in place that can stop phishing is really important. And hand in hand with that is things like staff awareness, so that folks know what to look for with phishing emails, and also a method for reporting suspicious emails to IT or to security so they can be investigated. It's possible you might want to take that even further. We know that hackers often abuse the same file types, and not all staff need access to those file types. So for example, zips, ISO files, batch files, LNKs, all of those, most users in a lot of organizations, I think, don't certainly need to receive them as attachments, and also don't need to be downloading those. And there's lots of methods both on firewalls, web proxies and mail filters where those can be blocked outright if possible. But a warning on that is the management overhead, because there's always those little edge cases where folks do need to receive zips or do need to receive LNKs or ISOs, etc. And that can become quite a burden if you've got to manage it day to day. I think the next big tip for me is EDR. I mentioned earlier that the attackers had a good foothold on patient zero, and EDR can be really central for not just detecting those kinds of attacks, but also preventing them in place and stopping attackers at patient zero. And if EDR isn't an option for you, there's also a lot of hardening that can be done of endpoints. If you're a Windows shop and you're using things like Windows Defender, there's attack surface reduction rules. There's a bunch of those available that can further harden devices that make it much trickier for an attacker to operate. There's also a few other tricks we can do. So for example, in the case of file encapsulation, which is where an attacker sends you, in this case, a zip file, within that might be an ISO, within that might be an LNK, we can disassociate some of those files from how they're usually handled. So when a user double clicks them, it doesn't open in the normal way. So that means people that need to open them can still do so, but for the average user, they're going to get a bit stuck. And that further decreases the likelihood that these attacks can be successful. Tools like remote connection guard and restricted admin as well can further restrict where credentials are cached. So if users do have high privilege and they're regularly using them around a network or a system, we can just reduce the likelihood that credentials are cached and then available to an attacker. And when we talk about privileged accounts, and I've mentioned this lots before, just least privilege is so key. If folks don't need a high level of privilege, so important we remove it from them. It's free to do. Any of us can do it. It's very straightforward. And that just reduces the likelihood that those highly privileged accounts will be available to an attacker. I mentioned earlier that these folks were using rclone for data exfiltration, and then also some RMMs like AnyDesk or TeamViewer for persistence. Now, tools like AppLocker, which is application allow listing in Windows, can be used to block those outright. Again, it's free, it's available. It can require some overhead to set it up. If you want to start collecting logs, that makes it a little bit more complicated. But there are ways today for free that all organizations can block those tools outright. Now, of course, that's not going to stop an attacker dead. They might find ways around it, but it might provide a good detection opportunity. And if the attacker isn't that sophisticated, that might stop them in their tracks. One of the other takeaways from the reporting was about backups and recovery and the importance of good backups that are regularly tested. In the report, they highlight that some of their systems were so heavily customized that it made it really difficult to recover them because they didn't have the full configuration. A lot of stuff had been built by consultants that had since left the organization, and that further delayed the recovery of those systems. Now, I like to think I'm a bit of a realist when it comes to backups. It's such an easy thing to say that we should all have good backups and we should test them on a regular basis. If you're a small organisation, I recognise that is difficult, and even for bigger organisations where you have a high level of complexity, it's also really tough to just say, we need to test our backups, but there's no point doing backups if you can't rely on them. So I really encourage you to think about how you could test them, how you can validate that they're working and they're effective, because when you need them, you really, really need them. And if they're not working, you might as well not have them. So that's all I've got time for today. I just wanted this to be a very quick walk through the attack against the GCC. I think it's a great example of a very common ransomware attack, albeit one where we've got some really rich reporting about what the attackers did. I've got a couple of articles on my LinkedIn that go into this in a little bit more detail, but I hope you found this video interesting, and I'll see you next time.